Hi, this is the Web Technologies Hangout. So we have a bunch of developers here, and we're going to talk about web technologies. So all things browser related. So I'm Jonathan Belcher. I'm a JavaScript electro wizard at Automatic, and I do the JavaScript stuff on WooCommerce.com. Peyton?
My name's Peyton. I'm a code wrangler at Automatic. I work on primarily customization systems, and yeah, I love experimenting with all these JavaScript technologies.
So Kevin?
Yeah, my name is Kevin Killingsworth. I'm also a code wrangler at Automatic, primarily focusing on WooCommerce and a lot of the new web tech that we're bringing in for that.
All right, so Dan?
Hi there, I'm Dan Wyman. I am a code wrangler at Automatic. I mostly work on WooCommerce. That's it.
Awesome. And last, we have Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Lowry. I'm a cyber wrangler at Automatic. I mostly work on the reader in WordPress.com. That's it.
Cool. So the general idea is we just sort of like to get together once a week and talk about things web technologies related. We all work remotely, so sometimes we don't get to have those fun lunchtime developer conversations. And this is an opportunity for us to talk about the topics that arise during the week that don't necessarily relate to our day job, but that seem interesting and it'd be fun to chat about. So Yarn happened a while back. I guess it's been a couple of weeks since that happened. And it's sort of taken everybody by surprise. Has anybody had a chance to use it yet?
Yeah, we've experimented with it a little bit on Calypso, primarily because it solves one of the problems we've had historically, which is that deploys before we were using shrink wrap were inconsistent. So every time we did every time we built the app for deployment, we ended up with a different set of packages, and we've mostly solved that with shrink wrap. But shrink wrap has its own set of crazy bits. So we were really interested in the lock files that Yarn gives you. And it works fine so far. We haven't pushed on it too hard because it's new. But as a straight replacement for NPM, it's great. It's fast, especially for rebuilds. The lock file is really nice. So if you check that in, everyone who's doing dev on the project gets the same packages installed.
Yeah.
The dedupe stuff is cool, but doesn't really work. You generally have different majors of different packages inside the node modules directory for a reason. And for us, I went through once and tried to do dedupe by hand, and you can't do it.
No, it's tough.
It's not for us.
Now, were you on like the latest NPM before? Because I mean okay. So
well, we're on what, NPM 3, whatever ships with 6.7, I think.
Okay.
Whatever. We tie our NPM version to the node version that we run on, and we run on the latest LTS for node. So whatever NPM is tied to that, we run on.
So back during my trial, I did some work on Calypso, and I remember that was one of the things that it was the version right before NPM went to the sort of the more flat tree, and I didn't realize that it was because it was only. I mean, I had been dealing with the flat tree probably for like 6 months, and I didn't realize that it wasn't, and I got super confused. But since the flat tree, it's made things a lot better in NPM, and I can imagine that it's even better in Yarn.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar idea. It's just Yarn does the resolution differently, so it's faster.
Yeah. Yeah,
I was always surprised that it wasn't a flat tree from the beginning.
yeah, that's it's difficult, right? And when you um, resolving all of the different packages and doing all of that well is really, really difficult. And it's good that we're finally there, but like the making that work and making that work well. I remember listening to a podcast and just them discussing it just made my mind explode. So
Yeah, it's actually burned us a couple times in Calypso too, where since modules that are only used, like a module who's only used by one version, or when you only have one version of a module in the whole tree, that ends up in the root, right? So now anything inside your application can require that thing and use it, even if we don't have an explicit dependency upon it. So like actually this sort of burned us with, our internationalization library depends on the LRU cache module. And Node, we also use NodeMon. We depend on version 4. NodeMon depends on version, I think, 2.7. And there was some code, and we didn't have an explicit dependency on LRU cache anywhere in Calypso. So there were things in Calypso using LRU cache, but we didn't have that dependency expressed anywhere. We were just getting it for free through IAT and Calypso. And that package then switched to using LRU instead of LRU cache because LRU cache doesn't work with Webpack 2. So when we updated that module, all of a sudden Calypso broke because LRU cache wasn't available anymore. Or actually it was available, but we were now getting, if you were a developer, you were getting version 2.7 of it. So it broke. And in production, it wasn't installed at all because NodeMon is a dev dependency. So in production, it wouldn't run. We actually wouldn't run. So yeah, it is tricky. You get some interesting problems with the flat module tree.
Speaking about dependencies, that's another really difficult one. Like when you have different versions of dependencies, because some packages that's okay, right? If I'm using this version of Lodash and you're using that version, it probably doesn't really matter. But if I'm using this version of React and you're using that one, that does matter, right? And there's no way for us to know package by package when it matters and when it doesn't.
Well, package management is really hard.
Yep.
I just came across this because I recently wiped my computer. I had some major issues. I don't know what happened, but which is the scary part. But so I just did a complete clean install, and I've attempted since I've done that to not to be very, very hesitant to npm globally install anything, and understanding, because when I would jump from project to project to project, my global ESLint or my global whatever it may be different for each different project. And so I'm trying to use the local version of that thing that gets installed with npm, and not have this like global thing out there that could be versioned differently for a bunch of different projects. The tough part about that is I no longer can just type ESLint into the command line because it's just not there and it's not available. So you have to specify it and say, hey, use the ESLint that's in my node modules folder, and it's sort of a pain. And then I don't know that I ever realized that I needed to do that. Because I had the global version there and available, and it was easy. And then also when you're using npm scripts, you don't have to specify that. So if you have in your package.json, if you specify like, hey, run ESLint, it will use the ESLint that's in your node modules folder But if you just do it directly on the command line, then it won't.
Yeah, and ESLint has some tricks too, where it the global version, when you run it, it'll actually look for the ESLint library in your local node modules and use that instead of whatever it came packaged with up in global.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, they added that. They haven't always had that. That was added, I want to say like 6 months ago.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of the command line tools do that now, where they'll have the library part and they'll have the CLI runner, and the CLI runner will actually look in the local node modules to figure out what it should use to run with.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't find anything.
Doesn't it seem like that sounds like the modules are kind of making up for a shortcoming of the overall system?
I think that like linters never had this problem until recently because they weren't pluggable generally. So you could just put your rules somewhere, whether inline in the file or in a config file in your project, and it would just work. But yeah, now that the linter itself, the versions and the configuration of the linter itself actually matters for different projects and the plugins. Yeah, it's like, I feel like it's still a problem that people are still working out. Although the separation of the library and the CLI is seems like a pretty good solution.
Yeah, as long as that contract doesn't change. It's like, yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's complicated. It's like DLL hell all over again, but slightly different.
Yeah.
So we started this talking about Yarn. I'd like to hear more about Yarn and how it relates to NPM. Is it going to replace NPM? Is that the intent, or is it going to work together with it? What's the deal?
Just another take on NPM. It's using the NPM database, and it's not intended to replace it because the concept is different, and it's kind of like what is it? That if you have, I read a good summary somewhere that was like, if you have an app, you want how does it work? Let's see. If you have a library versus an app, then the way you want your dependencies to work is different generally. Because with a library, you want you might probably want sort of flexible versions, because you'll want things like bug fixes to be rolled into your library, and versus if you have an app, you tend to want to lock things down because you want to know, you want to say, I want exactly these versions of things so that nothing breaks. So Yarn is it potentially is better for applications that want to specify exact versions, for example, Calypso, and versus NPM, regular NPM, which is maybe better for libraries. So I think they're both intended to coexist, although of course they're influencing each other. The Yarn came out of a lot of ideas that the NPM team was working on anyway. It's just that they couldn't implement because of that like paradigm cross. So that's my understanding of it.
Yeah, I think it's like they specify in the blog post that they put out. One of the titles is building a new client. It's just the client, so it's not meant to replace the NPM repository. It's just meant to replace the interface with the NPM repository or the collection. So I think it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, what the NPM client does in response to Yarn, and whether it's there'll be some sort of conversion. I mean, I know this is diverted a lot more than the what was it, IOJS?
Yeah.
So IOJS split off from Node because they didn't, all the things that happened. I won't get into the politics, but eventually, they were able to reconcile all those things and then come back in. Yarn is not a fork. I mean, it's significantly different. But at what point does NPM stop being the default and Yarn or something else in the future become the default client if it's obviously better? I don't know that Yarn has solidified that title of being obviously better yet, but I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, one of those things that you think that like, hey, like npm is this thing. I mean, this is like, and then all of a sudden it just changes on you.
Yeah, I think Peyton's
Well, that's
point
been
there was
somewhat
actually-
true in that.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say, I thought Peyton's point there was actually really good in that, as a library author, you're probably going to end up using NPM. You may end up using Yarn locally while you're doing dev, just because it's quicker. But yeah, if you're developing anything that's meant to be used everywhere, you're kind of in that like browser compat land, right? Where you have to work with NPM and you have to work with Yarn and you have to work with anything else that you think is going to be worthwhile to support. I mean, you may still be trying to support Bower. You may still be trying to support. You're probably not trying to support Component. There's a lot of stuff out there for package management, and it's you just have to work. And thankfully, it's all based on the same data and based on the same it's the same package file and the lock file is kind of a new wrinkle. And I don't know. Does anyone know? Did they ever figure out what lock files in libraries mean? I think the last I heard it was ignore them and go on with life. But
if a library
so like today, if a library itself has a shrink wrap, that shrink wrap will try to be respected, right? But in Yarn, I believe if a library had a lock file, that lock file is not respected. The only lock file that actually counted was the lock file at the root of the thing you were trying to. The base thing that was running npm install or yarn just running Yarn, I guess.
Yeah,
I don't know. Sorry.
You mentioned browser compat, and so I'm going to use that as a segue into. There was a conversation this week about, and this comes up, at least once a year, but websites that don't work without JavaScript, and there's a lot of strong opinions. And it seems like there's a lot of strong opinions on this because there's a lot of people that don't like JavaScript, that don't use JavaScript. And I mean, it's a very, very small percentage. But because people do turn off JavaScript, does that mean we need to, as developers, does that mean we need to support them? And, how far do we go to support I think it was something like 1.5% to 2% of all web traffic are browsers with JavaScript turned off.
I think it's almost less people who have JavaScript turned off and more about problems loading the JavaScript.
Yes, and then that was part of it. It was, I forget the exact numbers, but I think it was something like 1% has JavaScript turned off, and then the other percent was pages where the JavaScript didn't load for one reason or the other. And that's something that we should be, if we see high percentage of users not loading, the JavaScript not loading properly, then that means we should probably doing a couple things on our end to ensure that doesn't happen. But let's specifically talk about the 1% of people who have JavaScript turned off. Should we make sites usable by users who have decided to opt out of JavaScript?
I think you really have to think about what the job of your site is. I mean, if it's a web application that somebody's logging into to get a specific job done, you can kind of rely on your relationship with the user to agree to use JavaScript. But for general sites out there, there may be cases where you want it to be usable without. I mean, it's a tiny little minority, but it's a passionate minority. And if it's important to you to have those users, then sure, you want to make it turn offable. But that's an engineering effort. That's time. That's a distraction also from user experience effort that might go into other things. So
let's take, for example, Dan and I both work on the same team, and let's say we have an e-commerce store, and you're selling hats, and to make that page experience load faster and to add things to the cart without having to do a post to the page and refresh the entire page, does it does it make sense to, should we not use Ajax because we want to make it so that users without JavaScript can add things to their cart? Or do we have to spend an additional, I don't know, X% of time making features backwards compatible, so that if they do have JavaScript, let's use Ajax to add something to the cart. But if they don't have JavaScript, detect that and actually do a post call or do a post request and refresh the page. Like at what point do we give up on people who don't have JavaScript? Let's specify customer facing, like e-commerce or something that's not behind like a paywall or a login wall.
Kind of depends on your audience. If you're selling to that 1%, you better have it work without JavaScript. But
I guess a security crowd would probably, you'd want to make sure that.
Yeah. But this was an easier question to answer 20 years ago, when JavaScript was all about making your buttons change color, stuff like that. But you bring up Ajax, and we wind up building whole applications around this notion of scripting in the browser. And I think for general audiences, you can make the experience so much more pleasant with JavaScript that it's important that you support that. And if you've built it with that in mind, with the JavaScript first kind of solution, then you're pretty much building a second application to make it work without JavaScript, because you're no longer using it just to, change a little bit of the screen or to make your button green when you mouse over it. So I think that for most sites, you're really doing best to focus on the 99% of users. That's that's an opinion. I think an argument can be made that you want to make your site work for everyone. Just with the pressures of time and business, though, I tend to overlook that nowadays.
I'm entirely in the camp that, like, if you've turned JavaScript off, you're going to have a bad experience, and like that's just something that you accept if you turn off JavaScript. I know that's sort of blunt to say that, but like, look, if you turn off JavaScript, you can't. You're going to have, no matter where you go, what you do, like the web is just crippled without it. So.
To be honest, I'm kind of surprised that we're still talking about this. I remember, hearing about this 5-10 years ago, but geez, man.
Well, everybody keeps bringing it up, and there are like everybody seems to flip out about it, and so I guess if we're all in agreement, like that there's not really a discussion to have, then I guess we can move.
Well, I'm sure that most of us here are a little bit biased, right? Being sort of into the newer web technology stuff, I think we're going to tend towards running JavaScript. I'd be interested to find out a little bit more about this 1%. I mean, to me, it sounds like it's obviously not like beginner people on their browsers, because they probably don't even know how to turn off.
It's actually really hard to turn off JavaScript now. I was trying to do it in Chrome the other day, and it's like you have to really get down into several layers of menus and settings.
Let's be honest. There are people who have started up their browsers and who have bought something on an e-commerce site who have no idea what JavaScript is. They may have heard of the word, but they have zero idea of what it's doing on their browser.
The only conversations I've seen a lot recently around this topic have to do with progressive enhancement, and the thought that especially if your website has content, then you probably want to expose that content sooner and not have it rely on your JavaScript. I mean, because I think it really has to do with interactivity. If is your website something that displays content, or is it something that is an interactive tool? And like, if you were writing like an image editor or something on the web, there's a whole bunch of those. Like, I don't see any reason to try and make that work without JavaScript, because it would basically be impossible. I mean, obviously there's it's a gradient, and there's not a black and white cutoff point where a website becomes an app versus being a straight content site. But I think that things like news sites are very interesting. Somebody wrote an interesting article recently about how if you have a news site, you can there's all kinds of enhancements that news sites have, videos and like interactive features and stuff. But like the one thing that they should not prevent you from doing is reading the news. So this article was pointing to the idea of progressively enhancing your site so that the initial content is all there, it's all available, even if JavaScript or even CSS doesn't load. And I think that especially also for things like screen readers and for people who have accessibility constraints, it's really important to have things load and exist in the browser without in a sensical way without needing JavaScript.
Yeah.
I think most screen readers do deal with DOM manipulation fairly gracefully these days, though.
Yeah, they do, but a lot of times the problem is that as developers, we don't alert someone that something happened. So we'll have a button, and when you press the button, the person that's using a screen reader has no idea what happened. And we like to do these, modals and things that. So if I click a button down here, something over here has happened, but the person using a screen reader has no idea because they can't see it. So you've got to do, you got to use the ARIA labeling as well as, setting of the focus. And if it's a modal, you need to remove the ability to focus. So if you're going to gray out the screen behind, you have to remove the ability for focus on those things in the background and only allow focus on things in the foreground. And then reset that when you close that modal. And so, I mean, yes, they can do it. They can deal with DOM manipulation, but you have to let them know that you are manipulating the DOM. And the other way is, and I keep this handy. I always have a bandana, and so I'll turn on the Apple OS X has really, really great voiceover, and so I'll put on the bandana, across my eyes, and then turn on the screen reader and see if I can navigate things. And so always trying to do that with a new feature or a new piece of code, and you can fix things so quickly. But I could go into accessibility forever. But so that being said, another topic that I find really interesting is I want server-side rendering. And server-side rendering gets us past a lot of these issues. But trying to figure that out and trying to understand all of those different things is really difficult. And a lot of people have expressed the concern with JavaScript fatigue. And I think that there's two new libraries. Yeah, let's call them libraries that I've seen, Electrode and Next.js, that sort of take that full stack and put all of the different pieces together and package it so it's a lot easier to set up that server-side rendering and set up all that React scaffolding and all of that fun stuff. Has anybody taken a look at those yet? No worries. I've locally installed Electrode and messed around with it, and it was really, really great. So they're using Yeoman, so it's a Yeoman generator. So you use it. I guess it's Yo Electrode, name of your project, and it just scaffolds it out for you. It's actually quite nice, and they've added all sorts of features like progressive web app. So adds all the service workers and all that functionality that seems really, really difficult to set up on your own. It sets it all up for you. But once you take a look at that nice little skeleton that they've created, it actually makes everything seem really, 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 really easy, and it really helped me understand how all those different moving pieces fit together. Because I was a little lost. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I have used Create React app, which is a similar full stack development tool, and that's really helpful for at least for the stacks that I tend to be writing these days. And
does that scaffold out like a node like Express or something like that? And
yeah, it gives you actually something very similar to what our Calypso setup is. I mean, not actually, but close. It has yeah, there's a web server. It has well, it has React, obviously. It has let's see, what else does it have?
I didn't mean to
Add
put
in
you on the
Redux,
spot.
right?
Yeah, I think I can't actually remember if it has Redux or not. I feel like maybe it doesn't.
Not really.
But it does have like hot reloading and Webpack and source maps and let's see. It has this this basically there's a bunch of scripts that were added in the well, it's actually they're loaded from a separate module, and it runs those scripts when to do all kinds of things. So not only are you getting like hot reloading, for example, but there's this like nice little interface in your terminal to give you information about that. In fact, I think they might have added the dashboard recently, the Webpack dashboard or whatever it is. Anyway, it's a lightweight stack intended to make it easy to just start working on a React application, and it certainly does. And there's this eject command. So it's if you run the eject command, everything that's in the package that it's importing and using, all the scripts, all the other dependencies and things, gets just dumped into your repository, and you are now separate from the scaffolding generator tool thing, which means that you can then start customizing things yourself, which is really nice. Like if you want to edit your Webpack config, for example, or things like that. So you can't go back, but I think that's totally fine. And they keep improving it with more things. It's under a lot of development, even though it's being used quite a bit now.
Seems to me if there's one thing that the React community can learn from other communities, it's the value of a good CLI environment. These things are pretty useful in a lot of other technologies, like Ember, and Angular now has adopted Ember CLI, and they're doing it. And then also, the original one being like Rails, right? But I remember hearing another podcast about that. It was pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, so Rails, of course, like with their CLI, like absolutely amazing, and the Ember, a lot of the people that work on Ember came from the Rails community, and like that was amazing. Like I remember using the Ember CLI and thinking, oh man, this is insane. This is amazing.
Rails for JavaScript.
Yeah. I was an Ember fanboy. I just couldn't convince anybody ever to let me to write any. And so it's great to see Angular has a CLI, Polymer has a CLI now, and React has a CLI sort of. A CLI of sorts.
Yeah, I'd say React has. It's not that React has a CLI; it's that a bunch of CLIs have sprung up that use React, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's harder with React's case because React is just a view library. It's not Ember. It's not Rails. It's part of a whole. So you end up seeing all these opinions on how to incorporate that into a whole. So yeah, like Electrode. I was looking at Electrode, thinking we should probably whip up an extension for Electrode that let you talk to WP API.
Yeah,
that would be cool. Or to quickly build something like Calypso inside Electrode or inside. But Mozilla's got one called Neo. New York Times has one. everywhere all of a sudden.
Yeah, I think it's great, and this happened with Angular 1.0, not to this extent of like everybody started putting out the Angular stack, you know, what that thing was and all the different pieces that put together, and I think it was a really positive thing because you know, the more things you try, the more things that you try allow you to understand what actually works. And I think that was super positive, and there was a lot of things learned for Angular 2.0 that have had, you know, some really positive impacts. But yeah, so on the Electrode and the WP API, like I want to build a front end to do that. I'm not entirely sure how you. So let's say I have a WordPress post, right? And so inside that WordPress post, I have some link tags, I have some bolding, I have all of these things. So now I have HTML that is in that post, right? And I pull that down over the API, and now I want to render that. It has to be HTML, and it has to be passed as a string. So now I'm taking a string that has HTML in it, and I'm going to render that in the React application.
Yep.
Is there not some dangerous, cross-site scripting? Like usually, if I'm going to do anything like that, I would be escaping any content that I'm going to take in as a string. I'm not going to render it as HTML. Like how do you do that without like giving yourself security concerns?
That's exactly what we do in the reader. The way you do it without security concerns is you don't. You do have security concerns, like lots and lots of security concerns.
Yeah.
We rely on the API to do a fair bit of sanitization. WordPress already does that for you, which is nice. But it can include, so posts that are coming out of WordPress really expect to be rendered in the context of a single page or in a stream of posts. So they can contain script tags. They can contain all sorts of terrible and scary things. The way we get around it in the reader is we actually reparse that HTML string when it comes down and sanitize it on the client. And we redo that. We do that on the web client. We also do it on the native clients. So, and that's the only way to really be safe, right? The other thing we've looked at is trying to render the content in iframes and then sandbox the iframes. So you basically spin up an iframe, sandbox the thing, set its source to be not the current domain, so it doesn't get access to current cookies, and then render it that way. That didn't end up working for us because it's too slow. If you have basically a post stream of iframes, performance just goes to hell, and there's nothing you can do about it.
But if I'm in control of the people, I'm not in control of the people. If I'm in control of the so it would be a very small number of users that would have published access on the site. So if it's my site and I'm the only one publishing content, if I know I'm not going to put stupid content in there, then I'm relatively safe, I think.
Yeah.
Safer.
I mean, so the attacks there don't come from you doing stupid things generally. They come from people injecting stupid things into the stuff you did.
Okay.
Right? So classic example is like Comcast injects ads into non-HTTPS pages, right?
Yeah.
And that's your real worrying attack vector more than the site doing dumb things, because the site can do dumb things. It's still a concern, but securing it from outside influence is a bigger deal to me, which is one of the reasons we run everything over HTTPS on .com.
Yeah, absolutely.
It should be fine. I mean, what we end up doing at the end of it is injecting the content with dangerously set inner HTML or dangerously set HTML content, whatever it is. The one that starts with danger and throws warnings in the ESLint. That's what you got to do. And, you know, if you're getting HTML down, you've got to render it. So, yeah, I mean, the alternatives would be, you know, send down Markdown, send down some other non-HTML format that is known to not include script tags that you then have to transform on the client into something renderable. But that's not, if you're talking to WordPress, that's not where you're going to be generally.
No. Well, so yeah, the whole idea for me was to use Electrode to build a WooCommerce store, and so I don't know. I need to think about it a little bit more. Speaking of getting help from other, sorry, my segues are terrible. Speaking of getting help from other developers, GitHub this week or maybe last week released their GitHub review requests. I've been using them like crazy. I love it. I think it was something that was much needed in the UI. I don't know that I've gotten a ton of requests, Dan, but yeah, I think it's a really positive thing. You can specifically say, "Hey, I need you to take a look at this code," and that really blends well with their the actual code reviews that they implemented several months back. So I think this is really positive. Anybody else use them yet?
Oh yeah, they are fantastic. I mean, the code review is part of the process of using GitHub. So to have it built into GitHub instead of having to Slack people or whatever, it's been fantastic. I've been on the receiving and giving end of a few of those, and it's worked well. I really like how that's integrated.
Yeah,
I'll
we've been using
used them a little bit
review next time, John.
I mean, it seems like it's the thing we were doing before was just CCing people and pinging them on the ticket or on the PR. So there's a little less noise in the comments. In some ways, I actually kind of miss that you don't necessarily know who asked for the review now.
That's a good point.
Just that you were asked to review some code, which is a thing. It's, you know, that's double-edged.
Yeah, and you still have to put in the comments as to why you asked for the review.
Yeah, exactly. Before it was, you know, like if I wanted, if I was doing work on the infinite list component that we have that Bob wrote a big chunk of and Yuri wrote a big chunk of, I could ping them with a specific question in the comments, and it was real obvious why I was asking them to review the code. Yeah. Now it's more of a two-step thing. I have to, you know, I can still do it the old way, and I probably will. But to do it the technically right way is you'd add them as a reviewer and then ping them in the comments.
Yeah. So I come from a more structure. So I've worked in environments that have had zero structure, you know, no code reviews, just, hey, just push it to master, do whatever you got to do. But my previous couple of years have been spent in an environment where we used Garrett. And so Garrett stands between GitHub and so you push a commit up to Garrett, and it doesn't go into GitHub until it goes through an entire process. And so that process was you would have to get a certain number of reviews of you know, a +1 or +2 from a certain number of people before a commit could go through. And so working back in GitHub, you know, for pull requests on a daily basis has been a delight. But I do miss some of that structure. It's like I sometimes won't merge a pull request because I feel like I need more people to look at it, but other people won't look at it because it's already, you know, there's already a looks good to me on it. But I want that other person, hey, can I get another opinion? But I don't want to offend the person who said looks good to me because I'm saying that they're, you know, I want someone else to double check their check of my code. Do you get what I'm saying here? So I
Yeah.
think being able to structure and having some rules in place is tough with GitHub.
Yeah, and we used Garrett at a previous job too. And one of the things I did like about it was that you had to have 2+1s or you could configure it to require two different people to +1 something to merge it. But yeah, I will say the one thing I really do like about the new GitHub review system is that it's made approval more explicit. Whereas before you'd ask for a review on something and then, someone would find a problem with it or whatever, and you would leave a response to the problem as to why it wasn't actually a problem or it was intentional or anything. And then you'd get a thumbs up on your comment. And it's like, does that mean I can merge it now? Or does that mean, people weren't always real good about adding, we were using a ready to merge label to indicate that a given PR was ready to be able, or was able to be merged. And it was never all that consistent that people would add it. A lot of times they would approve the PR and then forget to add the label or change the label. And that's, like I said, that's one thing I really like about the new system is I can now just go to review, hit the approve radio, and sometimes not even leave a comment, but it's just explicit, like, yes, this is good, let's go.
So I have a friend and she flips out when someone leaves a comment but doesn't give you explicit one way or the other, whether it's good to merge or not good to merge. So what she does is she says, if you leave a comment and you don't tell me that I need to fix this before I push it in, then it's your opinion, and you need to tell me that I can't merge this until it fixes this, or I'm just going to merge it. Because it's you making a suggestion rather than saying you need to fix this.
So in that case, there's no requirement for approval, I guess.
Yeah. So if you leave a comment, you got to say approval or disapprove. Like you can't leave a comment and not go one way or the other. You can't just like leave a drive-by comment. So and since she said that, I said, okay, I totally get that. And so I always ensure that I say, hey, you need to fix this, or you can merge with this not changed.
Interesting. Yeah, I think the way we use GitHub, that doesn't come out as much because I would totally consider, if someone just left a comment and didn't say that approved or disapproved the merge, I would not disregard it, but I see that as a question. But I wouldn't necessarily merge anything that hadn't gotten explicit approval from someone, given the way GitHub works now. But yeah, if someone approved it and then someone else came in and said, hey, there's this thing, and didn't actually mark it as needs changes, I'd still merge it.
Exactly. I've actually found the grouping comments into a review feature more useful than the review feature itself. Like the ability you can start making a bunch of comments and then submit them all at once as one package, which is great for me because often I'm going through somebody's code line by line and I'll make some comment, but then later on I'll be like, oh no, now I understand why they did that way. So okay, I didn't need to make that comment after all, or maybe I just need to add some further details to one of the comments. There's 100 other situations I've encountered where it's been helpful, and I really like that feature. So
yeah, kind of a tangent, and if we don't want to discuss it now, that's fine. But how often do people, when you're doing a review, I feel like most reviews we end up doing, at least in Calypso, are very much kind of line by line, like nitpicky reviews. But the reviews that are actually more interesting to me and that cause problems longer term are the architectural reviews. So is the way this code is performing sane? Like is the way this fits into the overall structure of the app sane? How, and those often don't have anything to do with the actual lines in question that are under review. How do folks deal with those? Like, how do you approach that in a review where you're hitting something that's like, oh, but this doesn't really conform to how we generally do things in the application in under the thing you're reviewing.
Yeah, I guess
personally,
go ahead.
Go ahead, John. Oh, okay. Personally, I think if you've done a lot of reviews and if you've been on the giving and receiving side of reviews, hopefully you've developed a thicker skin to where you don't take things so personally. And in that case, certainly if I was on the receiving end of something and there were architectural issues around the code that I'd written, I would want that person to post that information there. Not necessarily that we'll take care of it right there in that PR, but maybe we'll open an issue, to go on from there and say, well, this other thing really needs to be fixed, something like that. But I feel like it should be fair game.
No, sorry. Yeah, maybe I wasn't clear in the question. It wasn't. I was less concerned about offending someone's feelings or that part of it, and more. There've been a bunch of cases where I'm reviewing code, and the way GitHub presents the code to review is it presents it as a diff, and a lot of times the diff is fine in isolation. But it turns out that the thing that they're modifying is code that's repeated 7 other places in the app, and we've just added 2 more, right? And hey, maybe this is a good opportunity to go and, consolidate some of this duplication that we have. But I can't. There's no way to point to that code in the review because it's not part of the diff yet.
Oh yeah.
Right. Like I want to add stuff to the diff that's not in the diff, because that's the code that I actually want to change. Like a real concrete example of that is we use the card metaphor in the reader a lot, and we have a lot of different kinds of cards. And when we were just doing this big rewrite we did, instead of modifying cards in place, we would copy the cards and modify the copies so that we had basically 2 different trees of components depending on which side of the feature flag you were on. And there were things we were finding that we wanted to consolidate. But since we were making this new component, you wanted to reference back to the old component and say, hey, there's this thing that's in both things that we need to pull out to a common place because it doesn't change.
In the past, what I've done is add something to the engineering backlog, or add an issue, and lay out the argument, say, hey, here's the architectural question, concern, thing I'd like to change, and we should do this. A lot of times, though, engineering backlogs get really, really long, and but making sure to document it, and in the short term, it's really tough because do we get this done and get it in? Or do we step back and re-architect and spend, another week trying to make this, trying to re-architect and make this thing work? But I think definitely creating a separate issue rather than doing it in a commit that doesn't necessarily has relation to it, but doesn't have that thing specifically in it.
Yeah, that's how I would handle it. I would create a separate issue, and then I would link that issue in the comments on that PR.
Yeah.
So that way you can still discuss it in the PR, even if the code is not actually there.
Yeah, and I think that there are exceptions. Like there was one PR I did where I was trying to change this thing, and it ended up becoming pretty clear that I should actually tackle the larger issue instead. And so eventually I just went and started adding commits that changed that whole issue. But I feel like that's definitely the exception, because usually, it's like what is it? There's a political thing you can do when if you don't want something to be passed, you just keep adding things to it. Anyway, I feel like it's like that. You can just keep adding kind of things to a PR or even to a commit and be like, yeah, this gets close to this other thing, so we should probably work on that too. And then the original thing never gets done. But I feel like it's just case by case, because you also don't want to introduce tons of unnecessary code to the code base that you're just going to remove later.
Yeah, PR.
Is this like a PR filibuster here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, PR scoping is a fun problem. It's fun.
Yeah, I don't know how many times I've cut a PR short just because the lines of code were getting quite large, over 500, is my usual rule. If it even approaches 500, that's when I cut it off and get it in a PR. And sometimes they go over a little bit, through some revisions in the PR process. But I'm not. I don't have any problems with throwing in the comments saying, okay, I know that this has this other architectural issue or whatever, so I've created a GitHub issue that's about that, and I'll close it whenever I've addressed it. As long as the code's not seriously breaking things, I think it's okay to throw in an issue for a refactor. But that's my personal rule, is if I'm going to delay something beyond a PR, there needs to be some tracking of it in an issue somewhere.
Sounds good.
Yeah, that's a good approach. I mean, it's important to keep those PRs concise. By cognitively grouping things that way, it makes it so much easier on your reviewers, and on you, so that the whole thing doesn't blossom into this giant system redesign in one PR. That's a good choice.
So we're at 11 o'clock. I figure we can, we'll end it here. But what we'll do is we'll pick it up next week, and I hope to see all y'all there.